give a little bit of a preamble to the next group of speakers that are going to come up from the UK. There's going to be a series of 3 speakers. The first is going to be Dr. Natalie Mount. She's the Chief Clinical Officer of UK's cell therapy Catapult. It's a brand new center that's focused on translational research in regenerative medicine. It's funded with dollars from the UK government for 5 years with plan to leverage approximately £20 million in industry funding. The next speaker after that is going to be Dr. Christopher Bravery, who's Director of Consulting on Advanced Biologics. Dr. Bravery is a former MHRA regulator. He can speak to the regulatory issues researchers need to consider as they plan a UK trial. And then the third speaker is Dr. Matthew Hallsworth, who's head of communications with the National Institute for Health Research's Office for Clinical Research Infrastructure. This acts apparently as the UK's single point of contact for UK's clinical trials processes and help researchers navigate both the regulatory environment and the facilities that are available. So basically, they're coming here to this workshop is they thought it was a unique opportunity to tell this workshop audience about the opportunities to conduct clinical trials in the UK and the different infrastructure and programs they've put in place. So it's a sort of an invitation to partake. So we're going to start with Dr. Natalie Mount's presentation.
Well, thank you very much, Ellen. It's a great pleasure to be here today and to take the opportunity. We've been involved in a bit of a Californian roadshow, so it's great to have this opportunity to come and also speak to you. I'm going to fairly rapidly explain about the cell therapy Catapult, and then pass over to the other speakers who, as Ellen said, are going to talk a bit about the regulatory environment and also then a bit more detail on the National Health Service clinical research environment. So the Cell Therapy Catapult is our new initiative in the UK, which is really around accelerating the development of cell therapies. So as the Cell Therapy Catapult, we're interested in cell therapies, accelerating their development, particularly looking at therapies which are maybe no more than 2 years away from the clinic up until the end of phase 2. And that's the kind of area that we work in. And I'll explain a bit about the centre itself and what we do and how we would like to work with researchers from this side of the Atlantic as well as in Europe. So actually a Catapult program is a UK government-sponsored program, and Catapults look at the bridging the gap between business, academia, research and government. So we have Catapults in areas where we have a strong science base, and we want to really create an industry coming out of that science base. There are 7 Catapults, but the only one in life science that was selected was the cell therapy Catapult. And that really recognised in the UK people's excitement about this area and the potential for cell and regenerative therapies in this area, and to really help turn the science base into real therapies for patients and also a commercial industry. So what we want to do at this Cell Therapy Catapult is for UK to build on our science and become a global leader in the development, delivery and commercialisation of cell therapy. We want to be a place where businesses can start and grow. And you'll see as we go through this, there's very much a strong business emphasis on this. And when the Catapult was built, people weren't, like myself, were recruited from industry who had a background in, for example, clinical development of cell therapies, which is my background, to really help grow businesses, but also then to meet the patient need in the UK and elsewhere. So what do we do at the Catapult? Well, as I mentioned, we are really focused on therapies which are no more than 2 years away from starting in the clinic up until the end of around about a robust phase 2 package. What we do with therapies in this time is really focused around 3 main groups. We have a business group, and our business group look at health economics. They look at business models and business plans. So we work a lot with all sorts of different people, but a lot with academics and academic clinicians who have ideas for therapies, some experience maybe with therapies. But what we noticed very early on, the Catapult is a new centre, we've only been running for a few months now, but we saw that people come in really needing help actually understanding how their therapy is eventually going to turn into a business that can therefore be viable and meet patient needs. So our business group, as well as doing contracting, do a lot of time with looking at health economics and business planning and business models for new therapies. The second group in the Catapult is really focused on, I guess, the next main bottleneck, an area we saw people having trouble with, which is really around their manufacturing and supply chain. So this is a lab-based group. About half of the Catapult is lab-based. And really here we work on people's processes with them, looking at their cost of goods and how they're going to scale up their therapies, and also addressing challenges like characterization and analytical assays in order to enable them to get into clinical studies to start with, but also importantly to build the packages we've been hearing about earlier on today as you go through development to actually make sure you have something which is going to be able to take you into phase 2 and beyond and be able to attract investment. And then the third group in the Catapult is my group, which is the clinical and regulatory group. So what we have is expertise in the regulatory landscape, both in-house and through a network of consultants. And we can help people both inside the UK understand how the UK and EU framework works, but also work with companies coming in or academics coming in from outside the UK and outside Europe who need help actually understanding the pathways, which can be complex depending on the type of product that they have. Making sure that people have the right preclinical packages, as we've been hearing earlier on today, and also helping with clinical trial design. And people who have been in the clinic with cell therapies will know how different and challenging it can be to get everything lined up for the clinical trial and actually deliver those. And those people who are coming up to that maybe don't know yet, but actually it really is a fairly complex undertaking and quite different to clinical trials in other indications. So we help people with design and we also help people with delivery. An important part of delivery for us in the UK is our access to patients to the National Health Service. And Matthew in a minute is going to talk a bit more about that and the infrastructure that's there, which is really a very, very valuable asset for us and something we use a lot in programs which come out of the UK, but also attract people in actually because we have this infrastructure. So those are the three main areas that the Catapult works in. And overall, as I mentioned, what we really want to do is strategically improve the cell therapy industry in the key areas. So one measure of this will be that we want to increase the number of cell therapies in UK clinical trial and clinical use. Obviously, we want to increase the number of quality cell therapies in trial and in clinical use, but increasing the pipeline is one measure. Another measure, which is towards the longer term, is that we need to create cell therapy companies that can succeed. And also for us, we actually want to make sure they stay in the UK and they have the access to funding they need to be able to stay in the UK. And we want to demonstrate that we can do this in the UK and increase our inward investment. And overall, we want to build a major £10 billion industry. So in terms of what we can offer to people who are considering coming to the UK from outside the UK, I would summarise that in the regulatory expertise part. And as Christopher will talk about in a minute, there are some elements which are the same between the EU and the US, but there are other areas where there are differences. And so we can help people navigate and find the best path for their therapy through those. We can accelerate clinical trials, and that's really through the infrastructure that Matthew's going to talk about in a minute, which has been a very big investment in the UK to make sure that the whole health service can work together to deliver these therapies. We can help people establish EU manufacturing, and if you want to do clinical studies outside the US, you may in some cases be able to export a frozen product and get it imported, but often actually you need to have an EU manufacturing site because of the limited shelf life. And so we maintain a very large database of the licensed GMP facilities and their particular specialisms to help them match up with the kind of facility they need for their therapy. And finally, we facilitate access to finance. And you may know, I'm sure, that the CIRM and MRC have a new grant, a funding proposal joint together. There's also a lot of other grant funding which is available to people who want to do work in the UK, so we can facilitate access to finance for those activities. So just finally, briefly, I think we mentioned important to, fundamental. So we are a not-for-profit company. So we operate as a funded body from the UK government, but we have our own board and our own procedures. So we are a not-for-profit company. Our core grant covers a number of activities, but then we also have income from other grant funders. And also in time we built an industry contract fee-for-service work. And we don't give out grants. What we do is use our assets to accelerate innovation. So we collaborate with people on their programs and apply our expertise that way. And then finally, I'll close just on showing you where the facility is and a little picture of it. And on the tall glass building on the right is a new kind of iconic structure in London, which is called the Shard. It's a very beautiful building, which is now actually complete. And for about $50, you can go to the top and look out over London. But that's not where we work. We get to look at it because we're in the slightly less beautiful big tower block next to it. But we get to look at them, they get to look at us. So I think that's probably fair. But that's where we are. It's Guy's Hospital in London, a good central London location, obviously very well connected to the rest of London infrastructure. And that's where our lab and office facilities are based. Okay, so I think I'll stop there and hand over to Christopher.
Thank you very much. So I only have a few minutes just to give you a little bit of a snapshot, but happy to talk to anybody in any more detail afterwards. The UK obviously sits within the European Union, and although it can be useful to sometimes to think of the European Union a little bit like the United States, each country being a state, we're not a federal country in the Union. We are individual countries. So not everything happens centrally, and in fact, little bits happen centrally, other things don't. So I'm going to try and sort of help to clarify that a little bit. But I wanted to sort of just quickly show this figure of Europe, and you'll see there's some green parts which are the European Economic Area. They're also included in the same legislation, if you like. And we have one central agency called the European Medicines Agency, which awards market authorizations to certain types of products. Most products that come under regenerative medicine would probably fall into that category. Certainly cell and gene therapy products are mandated to use it. But because we are a collection of countries working together, things that happen in our own boundaries in our own country tend to be our own responsibility, which includes clinical trials. So there's this confusion sometimes about the relative roles. So the important thing to know about the European Medicines Agency is it's nothing like the FDA. It's actually really a secretariat, and the work of the European Medicines Agency is undertaken by the agency staff of the national agencies under the banner of the EMA. So they provide the assessors to do the work of the EMA make everything happen. So when you talk about the EMA, really what you're talking about is a table with 30 people sitting around it at least, one from each of the country, and they have to sort of all agree in order to proceed, if you like. But don't go into them and start talking to them about clinical trials, because they say, hey, that's not our responsibility. Go and talk to the national agencies. So I won't go through this, I think, in the interest of time, but you'll have these slides. This is a figure taken from a document that I give you a reference to later on, which is a free download, and actually rather conveniently describes how you develop cell therapy products in the US and the EU. And this little figure just tries to explain the relative roles of the different agencies. So we have at least 30 different medicines agencies around the European Union. Obviously, the UK has one called the Medicines and Healthcare Products Regulatory Agency. Nice mouthful, MHRA. The GDP side of things, the Good Tissue Practices, comes under a different agency called the Human Tissue Authority. And actually, if you're interested in gametes, there's a different one for that. So you've seen a figure a bit like this earlier today, and actually rather conveniently had a nice walk through that. So you're familiar with this pattern of agency meetings and so on with the FDA. A little bit different in Europe. So I put this figure together to sort of look the same. On the top here, you have national agency interactions, and on the bottom there's the European Medicines Agency to try and help you understand the relative roles and the things you can do. So unlike here, you don't have regular periods where you're expected to roll up at the FDA and have a meeting, type A, B, C, whatever it's going to be. You choose when you want to see them and you ask. And in fact, you might be surprised that particularly in the early days of the European Medicines Agency, something like 60% of the submissions for market authorization had never gone to the EMA and asked for any advice at all. because you can get advice from the national agencies as well. So you have this sort of flexibility to ask different questions of different agencies. And in fact, sometimes people do a little tour around Europe and ask various agencies questions and then go to the EMA and sort of firm it all up a bit, so that they can understand what the differences might be and then really tackle the agency in a different way. So there's lots of interesting strategies with Europe, and I think there's lots of opportunities. But obviously I'm here partly to promote the UK, and what I should say about the UK is we're one of the most active member states within the European Medicines Agency. We have a lot of key roles on the various committees there, and we do a lot of the work of the European Medicines Agency. Places like Cyprus and Liechtenstein and, you know, tiny little places like that obviously really do very little at all because they don't have the manpower to do that. Germany, the UK have great big agencies. We dominate really in doing the work. So we are thought leaders, and we are influential, so it's a good place to come for that reason. Although we have only a couple of advanced therapies authorised in Europe, we obviously have lots of recombinant proteins and all sorts of things like that could also be considered regenerative medicine. But actually, around the various countries in Europe, there are quite a few cell and gene therapy products available through sort of, I don't really have time to go into the detail, but there are formally unlicensed, if you like, because of a transition in legislation within Europe. And the UK actually has 18 advanced therapies that are available to patients on a named patient basis, which is more than any other member state. So all I'm telling you that for is to let you know that there's a lot of experience within the UK with these products. And conveniently, here's a quick picture of London. So the MHRA is near Buckingham Palace, so you can pop in, see the Queen, and then nip in to ask about your medicines regulation. And if you need some money, then you can nip over to Canary Wharf to talk to your bankers, and then nip into the EMA and have a discussion with them. So it's a very convenient place to come for that reason too. Lots of airports, very, very handy. So almost on the end, because I don't have too much time. So what's the difference? There's a few subtle differences in Europe. The key thing to remember is that the principles, the scientific principles in which we regulate, are completely harmonized through ICH. So Europe, Japan, and the US use the same principles to regulate products. So everything you heard earlier about getting a product, an IND approved here with the FDA, is almost essentially the same for Europe. You should expect the same sort of standards to be applied. But you don't open an IND for a phase, you apply for a clinical trial for a specific trial. And unfortunately, you have to apply for that in every country you're going to do it, even if it's the same clinical trial. But there are moves afoot to improve that process, and I can talk to people about that later as well. We use entirely across the European Union, we use the Common Technical Document. We mostly have electronic submissions, etc. now as well. So if you prepared an IND in Common Technical Document format, not very much to change really to submit it for a CTD, other bits of paperwork. I think the other really key thing to remember is we have this other subtle difference. We have a requirement for something called a qualified person. And a qualified person actually has to be established in the community, i.e. they have to be a European. And you will need one of those in order to import your investigational product into Europe, or if you're making it in Europe, you need one in Europe. And that person takes responsibility to release the investigational product out for the clinical trial. They have to sign the paperwork, if you like, at the end. So you need someone to do that. And they also will provide a declaration of GMP compliance for your submission for your clinical trial. And there's some subtle differences between European and US GMP, but that's something that I don't have time to talk about, but it shouldn't be a major hurdle, and there may even be some other interesting advantages there. Obviously, the actual paperwork can be a little bit different. So I encourage you to have a look at this document, which is just short of 70 pages. It's a sort of bullet point description with lots of pretty pictures and even some pictures of Chondra Select in there, kindly donated by Tygenix. and some diagrams and tables and web links and stuff like that, which helps you understand in a sort of phased way if you're dealing with a cell product. Everything I've said about clinical trials approvals obviously is relevant, even if you've not got an advanced therapy product. What I would say about the UK, I think it's pretty pragmatic, it's science-based, we're pretty friendly. You get a cup of tea and some biscuits. Somebody said to me actually earlier this week, oh yeah, they gave us tea and biscuits. Oh, well, that's nice. Do go and chat to them. You can have informal talks, discussions with them. They have a sort of innovation office as well. The EMA also have something called the Innovation Task Force. But probably if you're looking early stage trials, I would go to a national agency first. And obviously I'm encouraging you to go to the UK. And hopefully now Matthew will tell you a lot about how our National Health Service is sort of set up to help facilitate you to do those clinical trials. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. And I'm aware I'm the last kind of speaker of the day, so I'll try not to keep you from your next appointments, receptions, etc. But I think it's interesting that we've been talking today around, we've heard a lot of detail about the regulatory side and how you work within these systems. But coming back to the workshop, which is kind of staying on the critical path to development of new therapies, these kind of new therapies, what I want to do is give you a quick lightning tour of what the UK has put in place to support that critical path, and give you really a kind of flavour for the model that we put in place, not only for cell therapies, but it's particularly relevant for cell therapies, and what we feel in the UK you need to be able to push this forward. So I'm from the UK Department of Health, UK government, and it's a government commitment to support life sciences research. So the first thing you need is political will to do these kind of things. So David Cameron, our Prime Minister, who came in coalition government 2-3 years ago now, we're in interesting fiscal times. I'm sure you're all thinking about the same thing with the various budgets that are coming up in the next few years. The interesting thing was when our coalition government came into power, we had a comprehensive spending review. That's how the government looks at its spending across all departments. And life sciences research was the only budget that went up across the entire government. So that showed, I think, the commitment, the political will to be able to develop a life sciences infrastructure, community and business that it was seen as a strength both for the health and wealth of the nation. So as David Cameron said, we've got a great history, but you can't rest on that. What you actually need is to think strategically about how you're going to support the development of therapies, and particularly new therapies like cell therapies or regenerative medicine treatments. And if you look at the old biopharma model, it's well recognised that that's becoming more difficult to maintain. And as new types of therapy are coming through, you've got to think about new ways of developing these. And it's much more about collaboration from an early stage right through the development of a new therapy, bringing academia and industry together, both bringing the expertise they have to bear to develop these new and sometimes complex therapies. So the strategy that was launched a couple of years ago and has had a refresh last year was really about opening up universities and businesses to be able to collaborate, both nationally and internationally. And I think the work that CIRM's doing with some of the UK researchers and the Medical Research Council is a very good example of that. It's about investing in some of these ideas at the early stage, and that's putting government money behind supporting some of this. And what we have in the UK, which is something unique, is a National Health Service. Covers 60 million people, free at the point of access, and is a cradle-to-grave healthcare system. What a fantastic place to do clinical research. If we get it right, if we get access to it right, if we get access to medical records correct, which is a lot of work going on, I think it's a fantastic test bed for new treatments. And so that's really sums up the kind of strategy and the political will. Okay, what else do you need to push innovation through this pathway effectively? Well, for in the drug model, and also in the model we're talking about today, in cell therapies, once you get to a later phase study, once you get to multi-center clinical trials, you actually don't want to fail at that stage. You put a lot of effort and investment into the development of your treatment, and actually confirming what you already know. However, at the early stage, if you're going to fail, you want to fail early. You need quick no-go decisions. But all of that needs to be supported by time, cost, and quality. But if we can shorten those timelines, it means for patients, they get treatments quicker. And if you're developing a business around a particular new treatment, you're actually going to get revenue generated more rapidly. So it's potentially a win-win situation. So what we as a department, a health department, have put in place is infrastructure really to support that process happening. So at the moment, what we say we think we can provide is world-leading science, some of the best equipped facilities, and access to these well-characterised 60 million patients. And the National Institute for Health Research, which if you like is the virtual wrapper around the Department of Health's funding, is the kind of platform for delivering that in the UK. The National Institute for Health Research is really a health research system. It's patients at the centre, treated in NHS hospitals, surrounded by the knowledge economy of our universities. And many of the investigators sit at the interface between universities and hospitals. And that's a very important place for them to sit because they're in the ideal research environment, but they've also got access to patients. Our health research system bolts around that. And all of this supports the kind of work that we've been talking about this afternoon, about developing these new innovative treatments. So it's about the key opinion leaders, the expert researchers, and supporting them. It's about actually supporting programs of research. And we've had calls for regenerative medicine funding across all of our funding agencies, coordinated ones. It's about busting the bureaucracy and actually getting some of the regulatory stuff lined up so it can happen quickly and get the studies up and running. But it's also about the research infrastructure that's required. And I'm just going to spend the last few minutes on what I mean by research infrastructure and how we've positioned that to support these kind of studies. By research infrastructure, we mostly mean people. It's usually people. It's actually buildings, bricks and mortar, and bits of kit that are required, whether that's scanners, imaging facilities, or technology platforms. How we structure it is like this. If you think about where our preclinical work is mostly funded by our Medical Research Council. That sits off the left-hand side of this slide here. Once you get into people, first into patients, first into man, that's where the health department's funding takes over. Now, this funding for infrastructure is not for projects. It's actually to free up people's time, clinicians, investigators' time, from their clinical jobs to buy out their time to focus on research and to support the kit, the staff, the facilities they need to do that high quality research. So if you look at the 4 first blocks there, these are chunks of infrastructure, usually physical centres, critical mass of investigators, so our biomedical research centres and units. And what I should say is this sounds small fry compared to US budgets, but this is about £1 billion of government money goes into this each year. So not an insignificant amount of money for the British government to invest in equipping researchers to work with industry and with academic partners. So our biomedical research centres and units gone through international peer review to the best of the best in the UK at pulling innovation from the laboratory into the clinic and actually beginning those first clinical studies. And that's exactly what you want for the type of studies that we've been talking about this afternoon. And I'll give you an example of where that's happening. They're co-located with what we call research facilities, which are the inpatient centres where these kind of studies, complex studies, can take place. Often you require an inpatient stay, particularly where you may be working in a paediatric space. We have facilities that focus on paediatric first inpatient studies and expertly equipped and experienced to do those studies. And we have a whole range of centres around the country that work as a network for early phase cancer medicine. And we fund those in collaboration with our large cancer charity. Okay, once you've got through that stage, and this may be looking far ahead for many of you, but you actually want the organisations in place to be able to run clinical trials efficiently. And we've equipped our NHS, embedded staff within our NHS, around 8,000 people within our National Health Service whose job it is to do clinical trials. And there's a handover from these early phase centres into this clinical trials infrastructure to make sure the patients are brought to it, the right clinicians are brought to it, and those trials can run effectively and efficiently. So as I say, that those are really experts in translational medicine, and we think they offer a direct route to work with some of the best individuals in the country. I'll flick through these. You have the slides later. These are our biomedical research centres. You'll recognise some of the names: Cambridge, Oxford, Imperial College, King's College, focusing on a huge area of disease and clinical need. Great Ormond Street, focusing on children, our large children's hospital. Moorfields, our premier eye disease hospital in the UK, focusing on eye disease, and I'll come back to that. And then we've got some centres that are focused on very specific areas, which you can see there. But I'll give you an example of how one of these works. So Moorfields, where most the sort of specialist eye disease is treated in the UK. They've run the first stem cell trial in Europe for actually treating blindness, and have had some amazing results. And it was a study that was run in conjunction with the American company, US company, Advanced Cell Technology. And it was a real example of where it was a collaborative approach was taken, with the company working with the expertise in this centre to actually get this trial up and running in Europe, and actually put the first patients through this study. So I think it's a real example of where these things can work. So the final thing you need is, that's a complex environment. You need an easy way in, and you need a sat-nav to get you through that environment. So that's where kind of my team comes in the Department of Health, and it's quite an innovative idea to put a team together who are the glue and the connectors, if you like. But that's where we want to make it easy to come and work in the UK and find the right partners to do that. So we think we can say there's access to a single point of entry to world-class science in some of our best institutions and patients across the NHS. So my team, which is very snappily titled acronym within an acronym, so we tend to just call ourselves NOCRI, we support industry but also academic partners through those range of things. And what we like to say really is with the introduction service, the dating service, the marriage service, and if required, the marriage guidance service. So we make sure those relationships happen. So the other thing I would say is, I said a little bit about the Medical Research Council working with CIRM to co-support international collaboration. They've just committed more funding, Medical Research Council, to do that. And we've got some colleagues in the audience, Nick Hooper, if you'd like to stick your hand up, and Catherine, who are from the Science and Innovation Network, from the UK government, based in the consulates here in San Francisco and in Los Angeles. And if you need any help and support, or begin to think to how to access this, they're your point contacts here in California to be able to do that. So the message is, I hope you see where we've put a system in place to support these kind of studies in the UK, and we're open for business and collaboration. So the tea and biscuits, the kettle's on, and the tea and biscuits are ready. So.